Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. First of all, thank you so much for everyone for being on tonight. My name is Samantha Chapman. I use she, her pronouns. I am the advocacy manager for the ACLU of South Dakota. I'm guessing since you're on this call, you're familiar with our organization, but just in case you're not, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that works to protect and expand the civil liberties guaranteed to everybody in the South Dakota and United States constitutions. So tonight we are going through our legal observer training. This is required for anybody who wants to volunteer with the ACLU to be present at mass demonstrations or public protests, or in situations where there is an interaction that is going to be expected between law enforcement and citizens, where volunteer legal observers are present to document law enforcement's actions. So really excited to be going through this training tonight. We've got a couple of different opportunities throughout the training to pause and answer any questions. So you don't have to hold them until the end, but we do have a couple of opportunities if you just hold them until you see the questions slide. So let's dive in. So to get started, we're going to go through just like an overview of what legal observing is. So what is a legal observer? These are ACLU volunteers who are charged with monitoring protests and public actions in communities across South Dakota. A legal observer helps people exercise their free speech rights and right to assemble by monitoring the government for any kind of constitutional violations and other disruptive behavior. It's really important to keep in mind that when you are a legal observer, you're really kind of setting aside and suspending your own First Amendment rights to stand up and protect the First Amendment rights of others. So we'll get into this a little bit more in a minute, but like essentially what I'm trying to say is that when you are volunteering as a legal observer, you are not out protesting, you are not communicating or sharing a message or using a public forum in that way. You are simply there to be a neutral third party and observe. So what do legal observers do? They are presiding over protests and other in-person actions to ensure that advocates and attendees are safe. They're going to be silently documenting what they're seeing, primarily how law enforcement is engaging with citizens at protests, rallies, and marches. They are, as I mentioned, documenting the actions of law enforcement and immigration agents and taking photos if it can be done safely. And then even better, recording video and audio if it can be done safely. Why are they important? Well, legal observers make it possible for South Dakotans to safely express their political views as fully as possible. You being present at a mass demonstration or a protest or a march will ensure that South Dakotans can express their views without unconstitutional disruption or interference by the government and with the least possible consequences from the criminal justice system. Your presence, like there in our beautiful blue ACLU vest that says legal observer on it, your presence will help deter police misconduct by simply being there to gather information that could be used in a civil rights lawsuit. Couple of basic requirements and considerations before doing any kind of legal observing on behalf of the ACLU. This is not to say that you couldn't, take these sort of things and apply them in a different situation for another organization. But if you want to volunteer on behalf of the ACLU as a legal observer, these are the things that you have to do. You have to be trained by us. So you're attending tonight's training. That's step one. Step two, we will ask you to sign a waiver and a confidentiality agreement. There's going to be sensitive information that you're documenting. So we want to make sure that you are fully aware that you know that you can't be sharing that information outside of how we ask you to do so. You have to be over the age of 18. If you're under the age of 18, you do have to have approval from your parent or guardian. And you need to have, this is very fundamental. You have to have a general understanding of protests and why people organize them and be aware of the current political climate in South Dakota around free speech and protest. It's really important that we know how, or that our volunteers understand how law enforcement is likely to engage with protesters so that they can anticipate and kind of know what to look for when they are legal observing. Safety is really, really important. We're going to hammer in on this point a few different times tonight, but you need to keep in mind your own safety as a paramount consideration. So only get as close in a protest or to law enforcement or a situation as you feel comfortable. If law enforcement instructs you to step back or to do anything else, abide by those instructions and try to find a better vantage point where you're not going to be in the way of law enforcement. And if you have any kind of limitations around like legal observing with like perhaps you might have prior convictions, your immigration status might be in flux right now, or you might have physical limitations, it's really important also to be honest with like your partners and the event organizers about what your limitations might be as a legal observer. Stay in contact with your lead coordinator on site. And then some things to keep in mind. We are a neutral third party when we're legal observers, and we are also not trying to collect information about protesters and attendees. Essentially, you're there to protect their rights. You're looking out to see how, again, law enforcement or ICE or any other governmental agency is interacting with protesters or attendees. So you're going to try to avoid gathering any kind of data that could reveal identity of protesters. We know now that in Trump's second term, he is likely to crack down on public demonstrations and on free speech rights. Even during his first term with a lot of the Black Lives Matters rallies, he called in the National Guard to try to fend off protesters and stifle public demonstrations. It's important that we're not taking any kind of footage or evidence that's going to identify protesters in the event that that could be used against them by a hostile federal government. And when you're volunteering with the ACLU as a legal observer, you can't be a participant in the protest or actions. Again, you are a neutral third party. That means we're not, oops, I'm sorry. That means you can't be holding a sign, you can't participate in any kind of chanting, certainly don't share any legal advice, and don't interfere in any way. You're like legitimately like a fly on the wall, taking notes and videos and photos. So again, ACLU legal observers have to be a neutral third party by all attendees. And what we mean by that, that means law enforcement cannot perceive you to be part of the demonstration, the protest, or the march. ICE can't see you as part of those things. Protesters also should not be looking at you and thinking that you are part of the protest. Bystanders, the press, witnesses, like truly from all different angles of the situation, you should appear to be completely neutral. Your job in that moment is simply to observe and document. Don't wear any kind of political apparel, hats, shirts, or buttons that might indicate your perspective on a given issue or the issue that the march or demonstration is organized around. Again, as we mentioned earlier, when you are volunteering as a legal observer, you're kind of putting aside your First Amendment rights in order to protect the rights of others. That's kind of like the really beautiful, wonderful gift that you are giving as a legal observer. It's important that you remain visible. Everyone should be able to see you at any given moment and be able to identify that you are a legal observer and not part of the crowd. So that means that you are going to be standing out. You don't want to be like in with the masses. Like you should be probably 20 feet away from the crowd, if at all possible. You want to wear the legal observer vest that we'll provide to you and brightly colored clothing underneath, so you're very hard to miss. And then it's just a basic little checklist of things to keep in mind before you go out to do any kind of legal observing. You're going to want to wear comfortable clothing that doesn't have, again, it's not going to express any kind of political view or something that could be construed as a political viewpoint or a controversial message. You want to wear likely pants that are going to fully cover your legs so that it's easy for you to move around and you aren't going to be encumbered by any exposed skin that could be harmed by, like, let's say you're in a park where there's lots of like tall grass nearby and you might need to run through the grass. You don't want exposed legs because it could be harmful. You want to wear pants to make sure that you're fully covered and safe from the elements. good idea to wear athletic shoes, sandal or not sandals, sneakers, or, any kind of closed toe lace up shoe that's going to, protect you from the elements and allow you to move around easily and quickly. You want to dress for the weather. If you are considering volunteering as a legal observer for the Sioux Falls Women's March that will take place in January, probably going to be pretty cold. You're going to want to make sure that you have appropriate layers of clothing so that you can stay warm. Try not to wear any jewelry. I'm sure like a wedding band is probably okay, but in general, we don't want anything that might catch on something and hurt you. And also, if at all possible, bring a digital camera or an old cell phone to use for documentation purposes. This is primarily because if for some reason the police engage with you and kind of try to unlawfully see content on your cell phone, having a digital camera kind of separates that from your actual phone, and it keeps it safer from any kind of data leak or I guess just like data mining from law enforcement. If you do have to use your phone to record, make sure that you have a passcode on it so that like law enforcement can't look at your documentation without actually getting a warrant first and getting your permission to open and view those photos and videos. You're going to want to wear, if you wear vision correction, like eyeglasses, make sure that they're super secure and they're not like loose and going to fall off your head. If you have a watch that you're willing to part ways with, that's a great way to keep track of time and to be able to document at what time certain actions took place. You should probably carry your photo ID just in case. Anything else that you might need to be comfortable, snacks, water, if you have meds that you need to take a certain time, mints, gum, sunscreen. Really important to avoid bringing anything that could be viewed as a weapon. So thinking about, or something that could like contain a weapon, like a large backpack. You don't want to bring illegal drugs, sensitive documents, or valuables. It sounds silly to say that, but it is important to name that just in case we just have to say those things. So essentially, how does legal observing work? There are certain kind of criteria that we think about when we're thinking about how legal observers can be effective at a given event or demonstration. You want to make sure that obviously you're there on time. You want to contact the lead organizer of that event or demonstration to get assignments and figure out who your partner is. In general, we always try to partner up legal observers so that there's not a one-off person. You should always have a partner so you have that accountability and those pair of eyes that are looking out for you, so you can also look out for your partner. Make sure to go over the emergency plan with the organizers and share your phone number with lead organizers so that you can be contacted. If there are more than 50 attendees at a march, demonstration, protest, we should have 2 or more observers in general. During a given shift, you're going to document any instance of potential police misconduct in your phone's notepad or on a paper notepad. So there's written documentation. When you are legal observing, stay on the sidewalk. We don't want to be on private property. Don't block any entrances, exits, driveways, and stay in the middle and keep the middle of the sidewalk clear. If you do have to occupy the entrance of a building, make sure that you're not clustering in front of the building so that people can safely and freely enter and exit the buildings. Don't overcrowd the sidewalks. Stand or pace kind of closest to the building or away from the street. Don't stand near any roadways or cars are driving for safety. I never trust cars. Like even when I'm walking with my children, I make them walk on the inside of the sidewalk. And I think that's a great best practice in general for any kind of march or demonstration as well. Don't block anyone from using the sidewalk. Make sure that you can see between law enforcement and protesters while you're also staying in the line of sight in your fellow legal observers. And we'll kind of go through, I have a couple of slides that kind of visualize what that looks like in a minute. Document everything. While you're there, the goal really is to document any incidents, arrests, and possible misconduct. So you're going to take notes, take videos, record audio, take photos. And this is really critical because your documentation might be needed for many purposes, but including determining penalties and damages, demonstrating police misconduct, and providing evidence in the event of a civil rights lawsuit. So, okay, as I mentioned before, we're kind of going to go through a couple of like visual examples of where you would position yourself as a legal, if you're observing, let's say in this case, we're observing a protest outside of a government building. So we've got our stairs, we've got all of our protesters kind of dispersed in the purple here. You can see we've got 2 police cars and then 5 law enforcement officers represented by these little blue stars. So the best place that you're going to want to stand if you are legal observing in this circumstance is here and here with your buddy. This looks like the size of a protest or demonstration that's managed with probably just 2 legal observers. Things look pretty orderly. Law enforcement is not super close to the protesters. It doesn't seem like things are hostile at this moment. And the reason you're going to stand over here, so that way you have a line of sight to the police, between the police and the protesters from this angle and from this angle. And you also have a line of sight to the protesters themselves. In a situation where you have a large number of people and maybe also a large number of law enforcement, again, the purple representing protesters or demonstrators and the blue representing law enforcement, you're going to want to have, well, several different, several legal observers so you can capture a lot of what's going on. So if you have legal observers standing over here, as represented by the green smileys, you have a clear line of sight, again, between the protesters and law enforcement. And over here from this angle, so you also have a line of sight between the protesters and law enforcement. And you're going to want to have some people in the back to watch the backs of the legal observers closer to law enforcement and protesters. So you have a line of sight here, line of sight here, here, and here. So everyone can see each other and everyone can see, and some people can see law enforcement and protesters in action. It's really important to keep in mind that when you are legal observing, it's not your job to intervene in any way, shape, or form in the event that there is conflict. So you don't need to be engaging in peacekeeping or trying to mediate any kind of conflict between protesters or counter protesters, police, attendees, bystanders, or anyone else. You're a third party, very neutral volunteer in this circumstance. Excuse me. We don't want you to become involved in any arguments. Do not try to negotiate the law with law enforcement. Do not get between law enforcement and protesters. And you're only here at that event or action to observe and document. Okay, so now I will pause for questions, and I see that we've got one in the Q&A from Braden. Yes, your question about so Braden's question about, does your phone need to have a passcode as opposed to like a Face ID or fingerprint ID? Yes, it is a best practice while you are acting as a legal observer. And also if you are a protester at an event, to change your phone settings. If you currently have your phone set to be Face ID, if you have a Face ID on and a police officer or law enforcement unlawfully wants to look at your phone without a warrant, the contents of your phone, law enforcement has to have a warrant from a judge to be able to look inside of your phone, right? They can't get into it without that. But if they want to just like circumvent that really quick, it's very easy for law enforcement to hold up your phone to your face to unlock it and then get access to the contents of your phone. My kids do this to me sometimes. So just taking a minute before you start your legal observing shift to have your phone be passcode protected rather than Face ID or fingerprint ID. That's one extra layer of like safeguarding against sensitive information being unlawfully accessed by law enforcement. Does anyone else have a question right now at this time? Okay, I don't see any, so we will keep moving. All right, so when you're volunteering as a legal observer, you want to document everything that you possibly can. Um, so you do that by taking notes, videos, audio sometimes, photos. You just want to make sure that if there's any potential incident of arrest, misconduct, violence, threats, harassment, any interference whatsoever with individuals expressing their First Amendment rights, we want to get that documented. Your documentation might be needed for in determining penalties and damages in a lawsuit or a case, demonstrating police misconduct, or providing evidence for civil rights lawsuits. So when you take notes, what do we want you to write down? We want you to be as accurate as possible, and we want you to take the date, the time, the location, names of any law enforcement officers that you know are documenting, badge numbers if you can get them, names of the people who are involved, the names of the witnesses, anyone who saw the same thing that you saw, descriptions of parties. And sometimes law enforcement doesn't want to share their names, or they won't give you their badge number. So writing down a physical description of what they look like, approximately how tall do you think they are? What is their build? What hair color do they have? Any distinguishing features, documenting that. And especially if there's any cars involved in any vehicle, in the event of an arrest or any unfortunately violence between vehicles and protesters, get down the make, model, and license plates of the cars that are involved in the situation. So here is an example of some things you might document in a situation where you are legal observing. So maybe you get word that there's going to be an ICE raid at a certain apartment complex. So you show up, and you see here there's 2 officers. So you might write down, okay, so you see 4 ICE agents walking into the apartment complex at 10 a.m. At 10:03, they begin questioning people, they stopped a man. The ICE agent asked the man about his neighbors. It's kind of hard to tell in this picture, but there is a man who's kind of blocked by this person in the police ICE vest. So that's the police ICE agent kind of asking the man about his neighbors. You'll notice in this photo that one of these law enforcement officers has a vest that only says police on it. It doesn't say police ICE. That's an important distinction to write down, because oftentimes local law enforcement does not want to be conflated with the federal ICE, agents. That really diminishes trust between local law enforcement and the community. So if you see somebody who's wearing just a police vest as opposed to a police ICE vest, it's important to distinguish that in your notes. And then you see 2 ICE agents went upstairs and questioned somebody. We'll say this is apartment B23 at 10:08 a.m. Here is another example. So this is a sit-in protest. You'll write down kind of and describe what you see. So you see a group of protesters who are at a sit-in in a government office. It's 9 a.m. Multiple officers responded. You count that there are 6 that you know for sure law enforcement at 9:15 a.m. The officers ordered the protesters to leave, and protesters did not respond at 9:17 a.m. Officers began arresting protesters, 9:22 a.m. No protesters resisted arrest, and no police became aggressive. These are all really important points of information to record when you're legal observing. Multiple witnesses filmed this with their phones. So that also is an important detail to include, because it tells us that there are other corroborating accounts that it can be reached out to if necessary. Physical contact. So if there is any kind of physical contact between law enforcement and protesters or demonstrators, it's really important to document a lot of different components of what you're seeing there. So if you know, if there's ICE or law enforcement that are physically limiting anybody's ability to move, or if protesters are physically limiting one another, ask yourself, are people adhering to the law enforcement's limits? So if the law enforcement issues a directive like disperse, or do not go beyond this line, or don't cross this line. Are people adhering to that, or are they ignoring that and ignoring the directive? Who is not, if they are ignoring that? What are they doing? How are the police responding to what people are doing? Is there any kind of physical contact at all? In these situations, it is our job as legal observers to keep our focus on the law enforcement and not, again, on the individual protesters or demonstrators. Keep track of what the police say and how they are speaking. What tone are they using? Are they yelling? Are they speaking calmly? Are they getting agitated? Are they raising their voice? Who are they talking to? Take very detailed notes if you see police caution or threaten anyone. If you are legal observing and you hear a law enforcement officer say, get back, or else, I'll arrest you, or whatever. If you hear any kind of escalation or threat, that's a really great time to take very, very detailed notes, video if at all possible. Are the police asking other people who are around the demonstration, or if in the event of, like, let's say an ICE raid, are they asking family members, neighbors, or passing by for IDs? Like, who is law enforcement interacting with and engaging with? Is their focus only on the protesters? Is it on, like, the surrounding environment as well? And who is being asked for any kind of identification or information? If you're seeing any kind of arrest, that's a really, really important thing to take very detailed notes on. So document how the police are handling arrests. Before an arrest occurred, did you hear the officer issue a clear warning to the individual? Was it audible to everybody? Did they cite any kind of law or a justification for the arrest? And in some cases, if you have a law background, maybe, was the law that they cited, was it potentially misquoted? These are important pieces of information for us. So documenting threats. If anyone's being threatened by law enforcement, as I mentioned earlier, please take detailed notes on that. Who is speaking and who are they speaking to? What are they threatening to do? Who is being threatened? How specific are the threats? In general, when law enforcement issues a directive, they have to not only say, get back, or if they issue a dispersal order, they have to say, you need to vacate this premises, let's say between the courthouse and the federal courthouse and Main Avenue by 10:30 a.m. Or else you will all be arrested. Like, how specific are they being with their threats? What's being said? Are they carrying out the threats that they're issuing? And if they are, who's carrying out those threats? It's unfortunate, but I think we all have to keep in mind that sometimes, that the potential for violence is always there. And so with that awareness, we need to be aware of our surroundings and keep our safety in mind. If you see anything escalating, like, step back. You don't have to be a hero. Is anyone encouraging the violence? Are protesters encouraging violence? Are counter protesters encouraging violence? Is law enforcement, trying to stoke the crowd of protesters to react to something? Who is speaking and what is being said? Again, do you notice law enforcement or ICE being rough with anybody? What are they doing exactly, and in response to what? In these kind of situations, video is really, really helpful to capture these really intense moments so that you can keep your focus on the situation and you're not, like, looking down at your phone and trying to type notes or writing in a notepad. Then you can just record if it's safe for you to do that. If you are recording video, please don't try to talk to describe the situation. In those moments, capturing that video and audio, it's important for us as the ACLU to be able to hear exactly what is being said, and to hear the sound that's being captured. So we don't want to hear, even though you might think it's helpful to say, hey, this is so and so, here's what happened, and here's what's happening now. Please don't do that. Just capture the video itself. Things to document if you do see violence at a protest or a demonstration, or anywhere you might be as volunteering as a legal observer. If anyone is touching another person, is there hostile physical contact, pushing, pulling, hitting, punching, slapping? Who approached who? What did they say? Who instigated it? And who was the target? These are important pieces of information for us. If you witness an arrest while you are legal observing, try to get the arrestee's name, birth date. If this person you know for a fact is an immigrant, get their A number, and try to ascertain like where are they being taken. You might not be able to get this information, in this case. And again, if you're trying to get this information, do not interfere in any way, shape, or form with the arrest. Just try to ask the individual who is being arrested for that information. Don't, and if law enforcement issues an order to step back, follow that directive. Document what is being said by the police or by immigration agents in that moment. Keep track of what specifically was being said to the person that was being arrested. And try to write your notes in a way so that we can tell who is speaking to whom. So Officer Brown said, get back or else, I'm going to have to detain you, to Peter, just try to write it in almost so it reads as a narrative. So it's easier for us to understand what was happening and how it all played out. And if you are documenting an arrest, you might be asked to testify in court in the event that there is a lawsuit, either on behalf of that individual who might have been unlawfully arrested, or on behalf of, law enforcement. Anyone could, ask you to present testimony. Communications in the media. So if you see the press or any members of the press at a protest or rally, please do not speak to them on behalf of the ACLU of South Dakota. If they ask you to give a statement or talk or say, what are you doing here? What are you seeing here? What's going on? Just direct them to ACLU staff or direct them to whoever the organizer of the event is. Just say that I'm here as a legal observer and I can't answer any questions. We don't want legal observers to be too busy talking to reporters and members of the press that they aren't documenting and doing what they're there to be doing, capturing what's happening. There's a chance that you'll be photographed or appear in a video by local media. But again, it's not your job or your role in that moment to be speaking to them beyond just saying, hey, I can't talk to you right now. I'm just doing my job as a legal observer. By all means, do not share any photos, videos, or any kind of written evidence with the media. Before you volunteer as a legal observer with the ACLU, we will have you sign a confidentiality agreement that will go through that. But primarily, that should be one of your biggest takeaways, is that any kind of documentation that you're capturing, you'll be sharing with the ACLU and the ACLU only. Don't live stream any of the video of what you are observing on social media. This presents a huge risk for people who are protesting who do not wish to be identified. Interacting with law enforcement. If you observe an arrest, you can ask the officer where they're being taken. But remember, we're really trying to limit our interactions with the police or ICE. So try to direct your questions at the person who is being arrested, and people who are nearby who are witnesses who provide that information, not the police or ICE if you can avoid it. Do not get arrested. If you get arrested, you're not going to be helpful as a legal observer anymore. If you're in jail, it's going to diminish your credibility. And if you're arrested, you're just really not doing anyone any good. It's not this. The point of being a legal observer is not to be arrested. Sometimes in public demonstrations, people do get arrested on purpose. That's not what legal observers are there to do. That's a different, it's a different tactic that's used in political organizing. Legal observers are there for documentation and witnessing. not for the purposes of being visibly and publicly arrested. As we said, in general, we really want you to avoid interacting with the police or ICE more than you absolutely have to. If you do interact with them, answer courteously, professionally, and as limited as possible. Do not say more than you have to say. Don't offer up any information, and don't try to argue or debate the law or what is or is not constitutional with the police. If they give you an order, immediately comply and stay calm. Do not escalate the situation. When we are legal observer, there are some inherent risks that are associated with that. Legal observers really have no special rights. There's always a possibility that you could be arrested along with protesters as much as you try to avoid it. Therefore, it's really important to take these very practical steps to protect yourself. Do not trespass. Do not argue with ICE or the police. Comply with orders even if you disagree. As I mentioned before, if you're asked to back up, back up. If you're told to disperse, disperse. Don't interfere with an arrest. You can and will be arrested for interfering. And again, you're not going to be doing us any good if you're arrested. We want you to document that arrest instead. Comply with orders. Because of all of these inherent risks, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, if you have any outstanding traffic tickets, a warrant for your arrest, immigration issues, you might not want this. This might not be the best volunteer opportunity for you. It's really important that you're considering your safety first. Only get as close as you feel comfortable in these situations. If you are arrested, there's no one to ensure that everyone's rights are upheld. So again, avoid being arrested. And remember that you are a neutral third party, first and foremost. After you're finished with your legal observer shift, you're going to want to reconnect with whoever the head organizer or ACLU staff member is on site. Go back and review, clean up your notes. If you had like a half-started sentence that you didn't quite get to finish or something that doesn't make sense when you read it again, tidy those up. Debrief what happened and what you saw with the organizer or ACLU staffer. And then turn over all of the evidence, like photos, videos, audio that you may have collected and notes to the appropriate person. Again, either the lead organizer or the ACLU staff member. Rarely, but sometimes legal observers will document the actions of counter protesters. Now, normally your focus is solely on police activities and you're not documenting what protesters or counter protesters are doing. But sometimes in some situations, you might collect information on counter protesters. This is at the direction of the ACLU staff member or the organizer on site. That's not something for you to really decide on your own. Please don't do that unless you are directed to do so. And this really only happens when a staff member, an ACLU staff member or organizer feels that there's a really important need to collect information to determine if police or government agents are treating protesters and counter protesters differently. But again, that's a determination that should be coming from the ACLU or from event organizers. And that I will pause and take any questions. Okay. The question is, can you talk a little bit about balancing the taking a video photo for documentation purposes, but not wanting to collect identifying information of protesters? Yes, this is a great question. So essentially, the focal point of your camera on your phone, camera or phone, should be law enforcement. You might catch, the side of somebody's face or someone else in frame, but generally try to keep the shot very, very tight on law enforcement, and specifically, if they are getting close enough that they are physically touching a protester, then it's probably pretty unavoidable for you're going to have to capture the protester as well in that situation. And also, if someone's being arrested, it's going to be challenging to not get that protester or person who is being arrested in frame. but to the best, especially when there isn't an incident of arrest or violence or hostility, it should be pretty easy for you to capture video or photos of police officers without getting any super detailed video or photo of protesters in the same frame as the law enforcement. Any other questions? Okay. So that is the end of our presentation, the end of our training. The next kind of steps in this situation, so in January, I know in Sioux Falls on January 18th, there is a women's march that's being organized. We will need legal observers for that women's march. Hard to know how many attendees will show up to that event. I think the very first women's march that we had in Sioux Falls directly after, excuse me, Trump's first election, there were like nearly 1,000 protesters showing up. And so in that case, if you want to have 2 legal observers for every 50 people, we're going to need a whole lot of legal observers in that situation. So we'll need people to sign up to volunteer on January 18th as legal observers for the Women's March in Sioux Falls. I'm going to also anticipate that there will be other women's marches organized across the state. The ACLU, a great role for us in these situations is to connect our trained legal observers with event organizers. And so if you'd like to sign up to volunteer for the Women's March, tomorrow I'll be sending around an email to everybody who attended this training tonight, asking them to sign up for one of those marches. And you can do that via that email. Okay, we have another question. Somebody says, I don't live in South Dakota, but I live in California. Does that matter? The ACLU of California and Southern California likely have different trainings and each state has different laws. And so this training specifically was made for legal observing in South Dakota. If you live in California, but you want to volunteer as a legal observer in South Dakota, that's totally fine. Now that you've completed this training, but if you wanted to go then do some legal observation in California, if you're trying to do that on behalf of the ACLU, I would recommend that you reach out to the ACLU of California and make sure that you are satisfying their requirements for their volunteer legal observers. Any other questions? Thoughts, considerations? Well, I really appreciate everybody's time tonight and your attention and consideration. If you think of a question between now and tomorrow or in the future, my email address is on this current slide. Send me an email. You can share it privately that way. And then again, look for an email from me tomorrow following up, asking you to sign up to volunteer during the Women's March. There might be other demonstrations or things that are organized before then that would require legal observers. And if there are, I will reach out to you and let you know. I've got people's communities where you live based off of your sign up information. So if I see something, if you live in Brookings and you attended this training, I will reach out to you about any kind of need for legal observers in Brookings. If you live in Sioux Falls or Rapid City, same situation. So with that, I guess I will let everybody get back to your evenings. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. I appreciate your time.